Hello, hello. Welcome to the Global Citizen Therapy Podcast, the podcast for women of color who are daughters of immigrants to feel seen, heard, and validated. My name is Nancy Diaz, and I am a trauma-informed therapist, speaker, and your podcast host today. And now, let's jump into today's episode. So, this is exciting. I actually had this idea for this episode a while back, so finally making it happen. I wanted to record an episode like this because, first of all, I thought it'd be fun. Second of all, I wanted to kind of debunk some myths. I think I don't know, people think that when you date a therapist or hook up with a therapist, that there's all these crazy things happening that aren't really happening. So anyway, I'm going to debunk a bit of those myths and tell you what it's really been like to date, have sexual encounters, all the things as a therapist. And we'll talk a little bit about, the comparison, what I've found it to be like pre-therapy days before I became a therapist, but also pre-healing days, and so there is that difference, right? The way I see it, because I began my own healing journey around the time that I began being a therapist. And so, yeah, so those two things will kind of dissect that a little bit. But yeah, man, let's dive into it. Oh, okay. So dating as a therapist. Interesting fact is that for me, I actually do not like telling people that I'm a therapist when I go on dates. So let's start with that because I think a lot of people, when I say this, they're a bit shocked and they're like, "Oh, really? Like you get like weird comments, weird questions like when you tell people that you're a therapist? Like I didn't know that it would be any different from any other profession." And I'm like, "No, it's gotten, pretty weird and pretty uncomfortable and pretty problematic and all the things, to the point that I actually don't tell people that I go on dates with, for the most part, that I am a therapist. I actually avoid the conversation about work and about occupation at all costs on the first date. And if, the question does come up of what do you do, I actually answer the question with I'm a social worker. And that's what I say. And that usually, weirdly enough, doesn't lead to any more follow-up questions. People are just like, oh, okay, like actually helps people, works with the poor, the needy, or whatever assumptions they make about, that social workers work in the community and, you know, with kids or elderly or whatever, people assume that social workers do, right? But in reality, social workers can also work as therapists. So, in the US and Australia, if you have a master's in social work, and of course, in other countries, I think this is the case as well. You have a master's in social work and you're actually trained to be a therapist. You have a bachelor's in social work, you're trained more to do what people usually assume social workers do, which is to work in the community, providing resources, helping, yeah, sometimes kids, sometimes you do work, in child protection services, sometimes you do work with elderly or disabled communities or whatever it is, right? But yeah, so I kind of use that lack of public knowledge, general like public knowledge to my favor, to my advantage, because I know that usually people will just assume that they know what a social worker does and doesn't do, and that will kind of be the end of the conversation. Sometimes the follow-up question that I do get is like, "Oh, who do you work with?" And so then I again will keep it very vague, and I will just say, "Oh, I work with women." Or like I work with women of color, and then usually it's just like, oh wow, that like must be really rewarding. And then that's kind of the end of it. And that's usually when I can switch the question to that person and just be like, oh, so what do you do? Like, tell me about your work, and really try to steer the conversation away from what I do. And the reason that I do this is actually because, yes, I have gotten some very interesting responses whenever I say that I'm a therapist. Um, One guy, we went on a date and first date, and when I said I'm a therapist, Actually, this has happened more than once, and this is the one that I really find really annoying is that they say, "Oh, well, that's great. Like maybe you can give me a free session." Like, "Oh, I really need it." And so many problems with that statement, with that response. Like, first of all, I don't give free sessions just like you wouldn't expect someone else to, you wouldn't expect a lawyer to give you an hour of their time for free. Like you shouldn't expect that of therapists, you know. Second of all, you can't give therapy to friends or partners. Like it doesn't work like that. So right away that tells me kind of like, oh, they right away it tells me that they probably haven't been to therapy, right? I am at the point, you know, where I've been a therapist, you know, for years, and I can kind of tell, like, with almost certainty whether a person has or has not been to therapy. Where I sometimes don't get it right is sometimes I might think this person probably hasn't been to therapy, when in reality, they might have been to therapy, but they didn't stay very long or they didn't get a lot out of it because they were working with a therapist that wasn't a good fit. And so they have this, you know, notion that therapy, you know, doesn't work, doesn't help, or, you know, whatever it is, right? And so they're more there to poke fun at therapy or don't really have a desire to understand what therapists do and how therapy helps, that kind of thing, right? So yes, that response is kind of one of the reasons that I started saying that. And actually, you know, with some people, even if it's just, you know, friends or, you know, usually, you know, if there's like a guy who I can just kind of tell like, oh, it's just not, I don't really want to have this conversation and whatever. Like, even if it's not a romantic interest, I might still say, like, I'm a social worker, just to avoid that whole conversation because I know that that can go down a weird path. I've also been on a first date where, you know, I told the person that I was a therapist, and then yes, that went okay, but then maybe an hour later, it was interesting because, yeah, he wanted to get some beers and go back to my place. And, you know, I agreed after, you know, setting some boundaries and saying like, sure, like I live nearby, so we can get some drinks and take them back to my place, but just as long as you know, like I don't want to have sex. And so yeah, he said, that's fine. And so we went and we did that. But then after a few drinks, the guy got pretty wasted and started crying about his ex to me and telling me about their problems and just, oh man. And I was like, okay, I mean, this could have happened if I hadn't told him that I was a therapist. But part of me also thought, like, he kind of is using me as his therapist right now. And it's really like hard for me to kind of separate and like even to get him out of my place, you know, it took hours to, you know, gently like nudge him, and I in the end had to be pretty firm with him and just be like, hey, I'm sorry, like I need to sleep, I have to work in the morning very early. And yeah, it took quite a lot of hinting, hints being ignored. And yeah, until I finally like was very direct and was like, sorry, I'm gonna have to ask you to leave. And yeah, like I know it's late and whatever, but like I can't sleep with you, you know, like making noise. You're not letting me sleep. So, and I need to sleep. So you're gonna have to go, you know. And it's yeah, there have been a couple, you know, instances where I'm like, yeah, you know, it'll be kind of interesting, you know, when I make it past, you know, first maybe 5 or 6 dates and, you know, have to all of a sudden be like, so, you know, like what I actually do is is give people therapy. Like, how do you feel about that? No. So the reason that I don't tell people on the first date, that I'm a therapist is that first I actually want to try to suss out, you know, ideally I try to suss it out on the first date if it comes up naturally. If it doesn't, then, you know, I try to give myself, you know, the first few dates to try to suss out if that person has been to therapy themselves yet or not, if they're open to it, what their thoughts are on therapy or just on healing, on personal development, if they have kind of been on that journey if they haven't, because I'm just at that point in my life where I've been doing so much work on myself and I've been going to therapy for a few years now and have been consistent with it. And of course, I think the fact that I at the moment work as a therapist is a big influence and a factor as well. But yeah, I'm at that point where I don't want to date someone who hasn't been to therapy or has begun their healing journey in another way because yeah, I just, and then there are the people who read a lot of self-development books and listen to podcasts and things like that. And that's where the line is like still a little bit gray, where I'm like, oh, that one, it would just have to be like a case by case basis. Like if they, and it more depends on like, are they open to it? Because being a therapist, here's the thing that I've realized is that it's kind of a really weird profession in that you're kind of like, the tooth fairy, like it's possible that people don't believe in you. And I mean, what other profession is there where people might not believe in you, right? It's just a really weird thing. And that's why, I have to suss out like, okay, does this person that I'm going on a date, like, do they believe in therapy, right? Or do they like, are they going to be one of those people who doesn't believe in mental health, who doesn't believe in mental illnesses, who, is opposed to yoga and meditation and like, and so usually like yes, I can kind of tell, from dating apps and profiles like what if that person is going to be more into self-development, if they're not, if they're kind of open-minded, if they're not. But if I can't, then I try to suss it out in the first few messages. But really I'm also not a big texter, and I don't even have my notifications on my phone. So I go through, I think most of us do, we go through phases where we're like, okay, into the dating apps and trying it, and then something will happen, usually a bad date, right? And then we're like, okay, I need to take a break from that. Let me take a step back, regroup, and then I'll go back to it later. Or I won't, like sometimes I think I'll get kind of fed up that we're like, oh, I'm like done with dating apps. It's definitely been me. Yeah, and I've actually been giving this a lot of thought lately that yeah, dating apps are kind of the way that things are done now, the way that you meet people now. And I don't even know that it's possible, I mean, I think it's possible to meet someone outside of dating apps, of course, but I don't know if it's as likely to meet someone outside of dating apps as it was before dating apps existed. Because I think that so many of us have just gotten used to dating apps and used to dating in that kind of way and, having that information about the person before actually meeting them and having it be like a controlled environment. I think these dating apps are great for those of us who like to be very in control, like to know what's going to happen, and yeah, just kind of control the narrative a little bit, right? And kind of choose who you're going to meet and who you're not going to meet, right? Which I guess you couldn't do before. But yeah, I mean, I've tried the speed dating thing. And yeah, definitely, I was so glad that the speed dating event that I went to, it asked us not to talk about work, right? So it specifically said on the form, and I think the event host mentioned it beforehand as well, like do not talk about work, or we're not here to talk about that, like talk about your interests, passions, hobbies, like you can use the questions in front of you as icebreakers, or to get ideas on like conversation topics. So that was good because I didn't actually have to say what I did, and I could use other questions to kind of suss out like what people were into, what they weren't into. One question that I've really enjoyed using since becoming a therapist with dating is, questions around values, kind of purpose in life, and just kind of their. So I try to ask more thought-provoking, deeper questions, and that usually tells me, can this person, have that type of conversation, that level of conversation, that depth, right? Or, are they kind of not the type of person that enjoys those types of conversations? Because I think, yeah, for me, in dating, I am looking for a partner who, you know, is intellectually stimulating, right? And can keep up when I want to talk about, real world things, right? Yeah, I'm not a big fan of small talk, and definitely in a relationship. I don't want to be in a relationship where all we talk about is kind of surface level things. And yeah, so definitely want to be with someone who keeps it interesting. So that's usually kind of the questions that I ask. Another myth that I want to debunk is that people actually think that therapists are always analyzing, that we're psychoanalyzing the people that we're on dates with. Some people think that even the people that we're friends with, that we're, like therapizing them, which I guess, is a word that I hear thrown around. All these things, right? And or that we're diagnosing them. That's the other one, right? I have gotten that in the past as well when I tell someone that I'm a therapist is like, oh, are you gonna diagnose me? Are you, and at one point, yeah, there were two guys that I was talking to, right? This was like at a general like language exchange meetup, right? It wasn't a dating event or anything like that. When I was talking to these two guys, they were pretty cute, but no, it was funny because as soon as they asked like what I did, no, actually I think I was chatting with one of them and I had told him when he asked what I did, I told him actually the truth in this case. I said I'm a therapist. And yeah, his reaction was I can't remember exactly what he said, but I remember that it wasn't so bad. But then actually when his friend or someone that he knew like sat down next to him, um yeah, he sat down and I was like, oh, okay, like this guy's even cuter, great. But then as soon as that guy sat down, the guy that had just been sitting with his friend or whatever, was like, oh, look, man, like she's a therapist. Like, oh, she can like diagnose you, she can analyze you, she's probably analyzing you right now. And he said it like as a joke, and we all laughed and whatever. But I was like, oh my God, really? Like this is not what I wanted. That's not great. Okay, well there goes that one, right? And yeah, in my head, I'm like, why did you tell him I'm a therapist? We could have had a fun time together without him knowing that, you know. But anyway, so yeah, definitely I think if I'm thinking that it's more likely that I'm interested in this person just for a hookup or like casual dating, then I probably will not bother at all to tell them I'm a therapist. When it's something like, oh, I'm starting to think like I'm interested in this person for something more serious, more long term, that's when I start to kind of like think more about like what I'm saying about what I do for work and what I'm not saying and how I can, because it's not a lie. I am a social worker, right? So that's actually, in the beginning when I was realizing like, oh, it's not great to tell, potential partners that I'm a therapist, right? Or dates or that I'm a therapist. What can I tell them instead? And at first, I think once or twice I did actually lie and say that I did something else. And then when I started to think about the lie, I was like, oh, you know what? Like, this is not technically a lie. I could say I'm a disability support worker. Because at the time, I think I actually was still, working one or two like very short shifts as a disability support worker, even though most of the time I was, working as a therapist and that kind of thing. So it started with that. And but then I was like, oh, you know what? I think I'm just going to say instead that I'm a social worker, and a lot of people, and I think in Australia too, when people think of social workers, they might think actually of a disability support worker. I know a few people who work in disability support work, they call themselves social workers, even if they don't have a degree in social work. So I thought, oh, like same difference, like, it's just easier, quicker off the tongue to say social worker, and then try to, flip it around on them and talk more about what they do and just avoid the topic for now. But it has been interesting because now I actually, give it quite a bit of thought, when what to say, how to answer the question. Because, for example, if I've been, on this date for a little bit, we've been chatting for a little while, and I start to get like a good vibe, like, okay, this person seems open-minded, this person seems like they work on themselves or whatever. Or like I'm just kind of getting like a sense like it might be okay to tell them the truth that I work as a therapist, that kind of thing. Then yeah, then I might actually go for it and tell them. But because of this, it's also interesting that I now pay very close attention to when the person asks me what I do for work. And I went on a date with this guy who, man, I think it had been like 45 minutes into the date and he had not stopped talking about himself. And then, yeah, I think like finally 45 minutes into the date, he asked what I did for work. And that was, I think, like the first question that he asked about me, because that's usually kind of typical on a date, right? Like that's kind of one of the first questions that people ask. It's usually like, where are you from? Or like, what do you do? And so, yeah, 45 minutes in, and I was like, wow, I can't. And this guy, I think I just let him keep talking because I was like, well, you know what he does for work and what he's talking about is actually interesting to me. But yeah, 45 minutes in, I was like, okay, well, it's all well and good that someone is interesting to you, but if they're really not, and they don't have those conversational skills where they can like put it back on you and make sure that you're also having the opportunity to talk about yourself and share about yourself, then yeah, usually it's not someone that I'm interested in. So yeah, I think I've learned a lot about dating, a lot about relationships and attachment styles and God, all the things I think related to dating since being a therapist. And I think just, starting my own healing journey and, being in therapy myself as well has been really helpful in kind of, taking a step back and even thinking about things that before becoming a therapist, before being in therapy myself, I maybe wouldn't have thought about. I wouldn't have taken the time to step back, to reflect. I think I was definitely more likely to jump into relationships and just kind of see what happened from there. Um, but yeah, I think now since starting this, I'm very, very careful and very, well, not even careful, but just intentional. Just very intentional with, who I choose to spend my time with. I've also been very intentional and even saying what it is that I want and identifying kind of my needs, my wants. And this is actually something that I do quite often with my clients, is that we kind of look at identifying those needs and those wants, because I think very often as daughters of immigrants, we've developed these people pleasing tendencies, starting with parent pleasing tendencies, of course, because in a lot of our cultures, it's seen as something that's so important, right? To respect our elders, to make sure that we're doing everything to make them comfortable, to make them feel like they are in control, right? That they are controlling the narrative of our lives, right? That's why parental expectations, within our communities is such a big thing and can be such a burden to us as daughters of immigrants, because yeah, usually they have this idea for you and what you want in your life, right? I think for my parents, they definitely had this idea of, okay, what we want for her, we want her to get an education, we want her to go to college. And then after that, we want her to get married and we want her to have kids. And that's kind of the narrative that they wanted for me, right? And as far as travel, they did want me to travel. I think they kind of saw it as like a big win and something to brag about to their friends or family members if, one of their daughters or, hopefully all their daughters could go abroad to Europe, for example, because that's seen as, oh, it's an expensive flight, it's an expensive trip, that means she's made it. But yeah, I think when I said like, oh, I'm going to Australia for a year, I could tell right away, like that was not their plan. That was not something that they wanted from me. It was something that they were, scared of, against, kind of against. Like they didn't really say like, we don't want you to do it or don't do it, but they were just kind of like, why? Like we don't understand like this, they didn't say this isn't part of the plan, but I could tell like this was not a part of their plan. When they said travel, they didn't mean move to another country or even go to another country for a year. They meant like go for a few days, And that's also the other thing, right? Like go for a few days, like even if I'm going to Europe or somewhere far away, because they're so used to hustling always and working so hard, they don't think that a a vacation or holiday should be more than a few weeks. Sorry, more than a few days. It definitely shouldn't be a few weeks. You know, you have to get back to work and make sure that you're earning money and make sure that you're safe and stable and have all that, right? So yeah, not a part of their plan. Also, not a part of their plan was me deciding that I didn't want to have kids. So I had that conversation with my mom, a few years ago. She was not a fan, and I think she did tell me that I would change my mind and whatever, whatever. So I was like, okay, well, and that's, I think that's a whole other conversation for another podcast episode. But yes, that's kind of where it's at, is that the dating, yeah, I don't know if I actually even do want to get married. Sometimes I do love, the rom-coms, and especially the ones where it's kind of like the non-traditional path, right? The non-traditional relationships where they decide like, yeah, like marriage, it just it's outdated. It doesn't really make sense for us, and it's a whole mess to untangle in a divorce. And we can be committed to each other without marriage. So yeah, I don't even know that I'm the type of person to want to be married. And even there are a few things that I'm like, oh, if I marry a man and taking his last name, and feeling um like, yeah, like I'm property of that person because I have their last name, like all these things that I'm like, yeah, it does seem a bit outdated. So I don't know if I'm 100% on board with the whole idea of marriage. And even, yeah, I mean, starting this journey, right, and exploring kind of what failed, what went wrong, um in my last relationship, things that I could have improved there, things that I know that I would have wanted my ex-partner to improve on, um, as in to say like things that I want to look for in a future partner, right? That my ex didn't have or did have, whatever it is, right? Uh, yeah, I've been able to kind of explore all of that in therapy and, through my own reflection. And yeah, that has been great because I'm just realizing like, okay, wow, it is really nice to kind of have that level of insight that I didn't have before. And there have been a lot of things that, I've realized like, wow, this is just the norm in our culture. Like, I'll give you an example. So I was casually seeing this guy when I lived in Perth, and he said something to me about being friends with his ex, right? And I was like, oh wow, like that's so interesting. Like I'm not friends with any of my exes, and that just like seems a bit like strange to me. And I didn't even mean it from a way, because we were casually dating anyway. Like we knew that it wasn't, um, but yeah, I actually didn't feel any jealousy or anything toward him when he said that, but I was just genuinely curious, right? And so I said, like, do you really think like, that a heterosexual man and a woman can be platonic friends, And he actually said, like, no, and like it actually, yeah, I think that you can. Um, and I was just like, wow, that's so interesting. And he gave the example, right? He's like, no, yeah, like we've slept together, obviously, but we're still good friends. And like I went to our wedding and whatever. And I was like, oh wow, like that's great that you can be like that supportive friend. And that it became entirely platonic after you were like in this relationship together. I said, that's great. I didn't know that could actually be a thing. Because, and I told him, I shared this with him, and I'll share with this with you all now, that I have a friend back home in Phoenix who is male, and he's been the only friend that I've had in my entire life that uh yeah, that's been entirely a platonic friendship. And it's been like interesting having that friendship, because if it hadn't been for that one guy, I'm thinking about like so many other friendships with guys that I had when I was, in high school, and then after high school in my early 20s, where yeah, I could easily be friends with a guy for a long time, even years. And then all of a sudden, one night, sometimes it was that we would both get drunk and then we'd hook up, sometimes I don't even think that alcohol needed to be involved, but just, we'd hook up. And it was interesting. I was watching, I think it's called Bonding, or I can't remember what the show is called on Netflix about a dominatrix. Really interesting series. And she said something that stayed with me. She said, like, oh, I always ruin things with sex. And yeah, and I just and I think the show referenced like a little bit, but didn't really go into any detail. But you can kind of tell that she had, a lot of trauma with, and she'd had bad experiences with men. And she mentioned at one point during one of the episodes that, you know, bad men had done bad things to her. And so that's why she's studying to be a therapist, right? And yeah, it was just interesting, and even the fact that she, found empowerment, right, and healing through being able to switch the narrative, have control, be the one calling the shots when she all of a sudden was a dominatrix, and she had men who were her subs, right? And she found that. And to me, all this has been interesting. One of the reasons that I wanted to make this season all about sex, sexuality, and sexual health is because I think that when we start to heal, in therapy and in other ways, it definitely starts to impact and show up in our sexual life as well, and vice versa, right? So, yeah, I mean, I think for her, it started with, she became a dominatrix and all of a sudden started to feel empowered and more confident in that. And you could see, like, through that show that, she starts off like very hesitant to date and to fall in love because she had been hurt and burned in the past. And I think that's a little bit where I am right now as well. But I'm actually going, well, it's a bit of both, right? So I've been doing things that have been empowering for me, in terms of my sexuality and my sexual health, that have been, helpful because then they kind of translate into, me improving my relationships with friends, with family, with, and just in general life, right? But it's also going the other way. The things that I'm talking about in therapy that aren't related to sex, in this case, that those are actually also helping me, right? Because in therapy, I'm working on, you know, healing my inner child. I'm working on improving my self-esteem, on processing, past traumas, all these things. And so that, of course, is helping me feel way more confident in the bedroom. Even the fact, like, I've been thinking, quite a bit, like one of the themes that's coming up, I think, for a lot of my clients right now is this, people pleasing, um, setting boundaries. I mean, it's something that always comes up for daughters of immigrants, right? We kind of suck at setting boundaries because, hello, it's just like not respectful in our cultures, right? To tell our parents no, or, all these things, right? Like they are maybe for our white counterparts, that it's okay to be really disrespectful to our parents. I think I experienced a lot of culture shock when I moved to Australia. And I don't think I've mentioned this part of my life or journey yet on the podcast, but I worked as a nanny for a year and a half. So working in childcare for, white Australian families was so interesting because I was like, well, this is so different from my childhood. This is so different from my parents. This is so different from my upbringing, because I could see that these kids are so disrespectful to their parents. They're yelling at them, they're talking back, they're saying no. And I just kept thinking so many times, like, oh my God, I would have been smacked upside the head. Like the chancla would have been coming, like, the chancla is the the sandal, right? Like the flip-flop, whatever, like the Mexican sandal, like whatever it is that the parents have on their feet, usually the mom. um, Dads, usually Mexican culture, Latino culture, I think in general, use more the belt, but of course, sometimes a wooden spoon or whatever. But I think a lot of cultures usually have that one thing, right? Or else it's usually the chancla that we know of. But anyway, yeah, usually it's something like that. And yeah, in these Australian families, from what I could see, like I think I only worked for one family, and I worked for a lot of families. I actually was working for a nanny agency, and they'd send me out to different family homes, sometimes just for short shifts, just because their regular nanny was out sick or on holiday or whatever, right? So in that year and a half, I actually, got to see inside um, the family dynamics of a lot of different, and across all different neighborhoods in Sydney. Um, and even like I worked for a family in like outback, like Queensland for a little bit as well. That was interesting. But yeah, out of all those families, there's only one family that actually believed in corporal punishment and did, smack their kids when they were being very bratty. And yeah, and I remember like during that first interaction that I had with that mom, she told me that she believes in corporal punishment, and she asked like if that was something that I was okay with because that's how she disciplined her kids. And I was like, oh yeah, like that's what my parents did to me. And so this was actually pre-working as a therapist. Well, this was I had already, gotten trained as a therapist, but this was during that year and a half break before I came back to doing this kind of work. And that was when I was really burned out, right? So I hadn't actually like worked too much as a therapist. And I remember that yeah, back then I was just like, oh yeah, that's totally fine. I think like more kids should, smack their kid, like more parents should smack their kids because some of these kids are really disrespectful, right? And it's only, since I started therapy, because I think like yeah, definitely during that time, I wasn't in therapy. I was working just a few hours and and not that that's an excuse because I think like, yeah, I definitely could have afforded therapy, but I think that just wasn't a priority for me. And so my money mindset was just at the point where I was like, no, I can't afford therapy. I can't, plus I was having fun kind of enjoying traveling because I would, work for a little bit and then quit and travel around to a different part of Australia and then come back. And, the agency would just give me more work. So it was, yeah, it was very different to, I think, what I was used to in the US, where you kind of couldn't quit because then you'd have a gap in your resume and all these things, right? So, yeah, anyway, point being that now I have a very different perspective on corporal punishment. I can see that no, it's not a great way to discipline your kids. It's not helpful. And yeah, now I can actually, believe those studies. I have more of an understanding of the effects of corporal punishment and that kind of thing. And yeah, to be honest with you, I don't know where I was going with that rant, but it's out there now. It's out there in the world. But yes, well, these are kind of my thoughts, reflections on dating as a therapist. It's been a journey, always learning, always continuing to learn. And yeah, I hope that you enjoyed hearing my musings today about dating and sex as a therapist. Yeah, it's not always easy, but we'll continue to see kind of what comes of it. I didn't date for a few years. I was just kind of focused on working on myself. And yeah, it is interesting that some guys, when I tell them that I've been single for a few years, they're like, "Oh my God." And they give you this look like, "Oh God, what is wrong with her?" And I'm like, right away, I'm like, okay, well, actually, like, what's wrong with you? Like, why are you so closed-minded that you can't imagine that woman could actually be single and happy for a few years? And I do sometimes, even from friends, they're well-intentioned, well-meaning, but sometimes there's a lot of judgment, even with us women, right? That you will say something to a friend about how you haven't had sex in a few months and whatever, and there will be like that judgment. I'm like, oh, you need to get laid. Like, let's get you laid. Let's find you someone. I'm like, well, it's all well and good if that's what I want. Then you'll try to help me, right? But I'm like, well, I think nowadays you don't really need help. It's kind of like as easy as ordering a pizza and download Tinder and right away you can have someone delivered to your door. But yeah, I was like, no, sometimes, libido is low and we're just focused on other things. Like I've been focused on my business, my passion, my purpose. And that's felt really good, for a long time. But now I'm kind of trying to make this a bit of more of a priority, find time, find the balance so that I am, putting more of an effort into dating. So happy to keep you guys updated on how that's going. But Yes, I will leave it there for now. All right, everyone. Take care. Bye. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed today's episode. As always, I am here to be open, honest, and vulnerable with you because you are not alone. If you want to support this podcast, please make sure to leave a review so others can find it as well. If you're interested in working with me, you can find me at www.globalcitizentherapy.com. And if you'd like to heal your relationship with self-care and learn more about how to find the type of soul care that works for you, you can find the link to my workshop in the description of this podcast episode. Thank you again, and see you next time.